Well, thanks for hanging out again as we continue here in our study. And I just realized that verse 44 was supposed to be broken up into two pieces, and I did it all in one in the last hour. So there won't be 12 of these, only 11. So this is number 10, and then there'll be one more at 6 p.m. But in verse 45, as we continue here, at last he stood up. Jesus comes out of this prayer. He stood up again and returned to the disciples. Remember, he just left them a stone's throw away, only to find them asleep, exhausted from grief. Now, Matthew and Mark, the other gospel writers, talk about this happening more than once. Jesus going back to the disciples and finding them asleep. John or Luke here just gives us this one and tells us that they were asleep, but they were exhausted from grief. Now, I think that's something that we've experienced in our lives that we can relate to, is just being overwhelmed with grief and getting to a place where we've realized that, we've been up for, 27 hours because we just spent, the last day in the hospital with somebody because something unexpected happened, and we've been in a waiting room or in a patient's room, or a loved one passes away unexpectedly, and just the overwhelming grief that eventually our body just has to go to sleep. We've stayed up, our mind is racing, just anxiety, worry, fear, tension. And the disciples find themselves in a place of like that, where they're exhausted from grief and they're asleep. What would have caused this for them? Understanding that they just came out of a couple hours before the Last Supper experience with Jesus. Were they worried and grieved at the thought of losing him? Had they embraced what was coming as best they could? Had they just given up? Had they taken on that the belief of fatalism, that all the events were predetermined and there was nothing they could do? So they just decided to do nothing. There was nothing to pray for. They didn't see prayer as an option then. We don't know. We know they were grieved and they were asleep while Jesus was under extreme agony and praying. I think we find ourselves in these places, though, where the situation may be overwhelming, for real overwhelming, not enlarged in our mind. We're not making more of something, but we're in the middle of a situation that's got great magnitude, and maybe we feel like there's nothing we can do, and we don't pray. We don't run to God as Jesus did, even before, and then was strengthened and went back and prayed more fervently. His prayers got stronger, more passionate. But I think the caution here for us is as we experience these things with Jesus as they were, and they had watched and experienced and lived through some of the greatest miracles Jesus had done, and then in his final hours, they were asleep with grief. And I don't want us as followers of Jesus to be in the middle of something that's happening with him and him find us asleep with grief, where we've just been overwhelmed by grief and we've taken no action in prayer. So I think that's the challenge for us, is to not let our circumstances overwhelm us, to ever believe that there's anything that's outside of God's reach, even when he's not responding the way we want him to, when he's not answering the prayer the way we specifically want it answered, to give up and to allow grief to overwhelm us, and then just kind of throw the towel in and just decide that there's nothing we can do. It is what it is, and there's nothing we can do. And I think that that's really a win for the enemy when we do that, when we give up, because there's always the relationship at stake. And God wants us to draw closer to him through all things, believing from his word that all things work together for the good. So we will experience these times. This is the beauty of this life. We will experience pain and suffering, And our hope, my hope is that we do not find ourselves falling asleep on Jesus, but that we are joining him, understanding the power that we have as a child of God to go to the throne of our King in prayer and trust his will, not ours, and his way is always right. So I will see you at 6 o'clock for our final get together here as we wrap up with verse 46, and then just a few thoughts to end this Good Friday together. Thanks again. Appreciate you guys.